Hello, I'm Deb Johnson from Our Time to Quilt, and today I've decided to start something that I'm calling Beginner Basics. I thought, I just kind of started out by talking about quilting, but I've heard from more and more of you saying, I'd really love to learn how to quilt, or I'd love how to do this skill or that skill, and I thought, I'm going to do introductory videos that will help you, whether you're a beginner or whether maybe you've just forgotten something or would like to hone up some of your skills. So I've decided to start a series of these brief videos that kind of get you started. You may want to get a little notebook and take notes, especially if you're a beginner. And I'll introduce you to the tools, the tricks, and the practices of quilting. Quilting is a passion of mine. So today we're first going to look at cutting tools. What are cutting tools? Well, I will tell you that when I started quilting back in the dark ages of 1988, we didn't know about rotary cutters yet. Now, I learned along the way that they were invented in 1979, but I think it took a long time for the general public to learn about them and use them, because I didn't know anything about them that early. So rotary cutters have changed quilting. I took my first class from Kathy Smith in Southern Maryland. Hello, Kathy, I hope you're out there. She did a wonderful job of teaching us how to make a sampler, and that way she taught us a lot of various skills along the way. But I remember that being a very frugal person, I looked at her treasure trove of templates. Now, these weren't the templates like we think of today. They were cardboard templates, most of them made out of cereal box cardboard. And what you would do if you wanted to make a 4-patch quilt, you would take whatever size cardboard template you wanted to use and a pencil. And I'm not talking about a special pencil. I'm talking about a number 2 pencil. And you would take that template, put it on the back side of the fabric and trace around, and then take scissors and cut. And you would cut one piece at a time. I remember I would try to cut too many at a time, and my accuracy was always a problem for me. But luckily, then rotary cutters came along, and boy did they change the quilt industry. With rotary cutters, you could finally be assured of having a good, accurate cut. Now, they come with their own problems, and let me show you. Rotary cutters are like having a razor blade on scissors. And I've been lucky, I've never cut myself. But I think there's a good reason, and I'll tell you why. I have nipped off the end of fingernails before, so be careful. But when you use a rotary cutter, just make sure to always close the blade. And don't use a rotary cutter if you're too tired to be really aware that you are dealing with a very sharp implement. This was probably the second of my rotary cutters. I've had it for many years. I think the first one was kind of a straight yellow one with not a very good safety guard system. They've come a long way. This one, when you want to use it, you push the handle down, it lowers the blade. Then when you're finished cutting it, it's got a little safety knob there, and the blade snaps back in place. And I like this one. The reason I don't use it anymore, in fact, you can see it was a Fiskars, and see how the name has been rubbed off. But the reason I don't use it much anymore is because I have a bad back, and I don't like cutting standing up. And with a cutter like this, you pretty much have to stand up to get the leverage to make the cuts on the fabric you need. So that I can sit and cut, I prefer what's called the Martelli rotary cutter. And it's an unusual looking thing, isn't it? But this is an ergonomic rotary cutter. It's an automatically close. I do like the newer lines of rotary cutters that automatically close when you're not putting pressure on them. But this one is so nice because as I hold it and put my finger here for leverage, my wrist is straight and I can do all my cutting sitting down, which is wonderful for my back. Any of you who have carpal tunnel issues, strength issues, and bad backs, consider getting a Martelli rotary cutter. And they're run $19 to $24, and you can find them lots of places. Just remember Martelli. But this one's wonderful. I have at least 3 because it's changed my life. I had carpal tunnel surgery, but before that, my hand would go numb trying to use a rotary cutter. So I'm very grateful for these, and I feel like, why stress my wrist anymore than I have to? As you can tell, I'm left-handed. The right-handed cutter has a red handle. The left-handed has a black. Now, I think I even saw the new ones that have a blue handle for us lefties. So now, before you put it down, get yourself used to a habit. Before you put this down, close it. You'll be very glad you did. Another thing about safety is being very careful where that blade is and keeping your other hand far away, because it's usually not your cutting hand that gets cut. It's your holding hand. So I'll show you a little bit more about that. Talking about rotary cutters, there's many different kinds. And this brings us to questions like, how many layers of fabric can you cut at one time? Since I sit down with mine, the most layers I ever cut at one time is 4. And you can decide what works for you. If I want to cut more layers than that, then I would get a 60mm blade. This size, the standard size, is a 45mm. And that works well for most things. Now I want to show you, this is a different cutter, and it's good to have a case for your rotary cutter. So I have this case right here, and it holds, it's supposed to be a pencil case, but it works great for this one. This is a Alpha. This is an Alpha rotary cutter, which was the company that first invented rotary cutters. Thank you, Alpha. You changed the world. I like this because it's got a safety handle. You have to pull this and then you can cut. So I do like this one. And it also has a safety button. So now once that's closed, no matter how many times you squeeze the handle, the reason having safety and a safety cutter and a safety lock is, I have a friend who dropped a rotary cutter on her foot, and it hit a large enough vein that she had to go to the emergency room. They could not stop the bleeding. It was a real problem. Now, I don't want to scare you, though, about this. Like I say, I've been quilting for over 30 years, and I've never cut myself. I've been very lucky and careful. And there's another reason that I'll show you in just a moment. So we've talked about 45mm. Get that first. That's the first rotary cutter you should buy. Nice standard rotary cutter, can do all kinds of things. Then I told you about the 60mm, which has an even bigger blade. Then there's these cute little ones that have a 28mm blade. And this is very basic safety. And then this one is nice because if you're doing curves and things, see, I can take off the safety lid. If you're doing curves, you can get work right around this to cut out curves. And that's where, if you're using one this small, it's because you're cutting around curves. Otherwise, most everything I use my 45mm blade. So I keep both of these in an old eyeglass container. That way it's just safe. If you drop it, you're dropping a plastic case, not a cutter. I also have one of these wonderful magnetic boxes, and I drop my tools. When I finish using my cutter, I drop them in, close the lid. That way they're safe. You don't have to worry about them. Now, also you can use cookie tins to store things in. I store my new blades, different things like this. You can buy handles with little suction cups for your rulers, but I'll show you that in a minute. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but you can store quite a few things in a nice little tin. And you know what I like to do is I like to save the little desiccant packages you get in things from time to time, and I will store them with my metal tools to keep any corrosion down, any moisture from rusting, because you do have to protect the blades from rust. Now, if you have a rotary cutter, with rotary blades, you have to decide, how can I keep the rotary cutter working well and nice and sharp? This is what I have used all the years I've been a quilter. This one was made by Dritz, and it consists of a wheel with a rougher sandpaper side and then a smoothing disc on the other side. And here's the magic tool, and it's on a screw system. You put your blade, now let me show you. Here is a dirty, dull blade, and if you were able to put that under a microscope, you would see little tiny nicks. If the blade gets nicks on it that you can see, throw the blade away, and throw it away safely inside a container where no one can risk cutting themselves through the garbage bag. But this one doesn't have any obvious nicks. It's just dull, dirty. So the first thing I'm going to do is take a thick wash rag and very carefully, not rubbing the edges where the blade is, but the center, trying to get it a little cleaned up. You know, you get a little bit of rubbing against the knife and a little wearing off of the plastic of the cutter, so it's a good thing to give it a little clean carefully. You take a Dritz. Dritz makes these. Amazon, they're listed for $15.85 on Amazon, or you can get a Colonial company is the ones I've used in the past. But you lay the blade on here so that it's roughly centered. You want it reasonably centered on the tool. Then you take it and you place the blade on the rough side of the sandpaper, and I use a little bit of muscle, and I think that's why I have good luck, is because I put something into it. And what you'll notice, I stop and turn my hand. So I had my hand this way, I turn it and rub it some more, and that just keeps me from having start and stop lines on the blade. Once I've done that side, then I flip it over this way and lay it on the trimmer, and I give it a little bit of pushing. I take my hand off, turn it, and do it again. Once I've done both sides equally, then I take it and put it on the dark or the honing, smoothing side, and do the same thing. Rub, 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 stop, turn my hand, and do some more. Now do the other side, because remember, the blade has two sides. If you did one side without the other, you'd think you hadn't even sharpened it at all. So I rub it, stop, and turn it again. Now you can buy expensive blade sharpeners, but there's really no need for that. And not in the beginning. Quilting is not a cheap hobby, but you can carefully make that hobby something that you can more easily afford. So now look at this blade. I have cleaned it, and I see how that edge kind of sparkles. Now you can use this blade again, and if you're careful, you can get quite a few uses of the blade. At a certain point, you'll try sharpening it, you try cutting, and it really just doesn't cut it. Throw the blade safely away. They don't last forever. Now, where do you get these blades? Well, I sew and quilt enough that, and I'm on a budget, and so the last place I bought my blades was from Amazon, and I got this pack, 15 Rotary Cutter blades, $12.99. That is a good price, and I found them to be pretty good. Now you can get titanium blades that last longer, but they're very expensive, and I'm not quite willing to pay that price yet. But this pack of blades will probably last me at least 3 years, especially if I keep them clean. Sometimes on the Rotary Cutter, let me get my Rotary Cutter. When you're putting the blade back in, if you put a little drop of oil on the plastic, this red plastic part that the blade runs against, just put a little drop of machine oil, just a little. It'll just help it run a little smoother. You definitely clean when I take out the blade to sharpen it, I clean the entire rotary cutter because a lot of lint builds up in there. And then I put my name on everything. There's nothing worse when you're starting out quilting and having to spend money on tools than to lose something. So get into a habit of making little, I'll show you scissor fobs later, and taking a good Sharpie marker and putting your name on everything. So now we've talked about rotary cutters. I've showed you their blades and how to keep them sharp and clean, and how to store them in a container, hopefully with a little, you know, the little packs that you find, especially in electronics when they ship it. And I have a drawer, I just save those in it. And then I can drop them into different things that I don't open as often. So now we have talked about a rotary cutter. Well, how do what do we use the rotary cutter on? We use the rotary cutter on a cutting mat. And this is my newest cutting mat, and that's a Quilters Select. But you've probably seen the green cutting mats, and all different companies make them. Omnigrid, Alpha, Quilters Select. I got this latest Quilters Select because they're still continuing to improve the products along the way. A whole lot different than what we started with. And so this is a double-sided. They didn't used to come double-sided. And like this right here, there's not a double side on it. So you pretty much had one side that you could do your cutting on. The nice thing is they have grids. Now some people have told me, oh, well, you can't be sure that the grids are lined up. They usually are very accurate. And unless you've really abused your mat, I think you can trust them pretty good. So this is a cutting mat. The cutting mats are called self-healing. It's not truly healing. What they mean is that the plastic material they're made out of have a very strong memory. And memory is what makes a spring go back into shape. Well, when you do a cut along one of these mats, and that's why you can't just use any piece of plastic. These mats, and they're a little expensive, I understand, but they are made so that when you do the cutting and it forms a little opening in the mat, the memory will shrink it back together. Because if you didn't, what would happen is you'd have big furrows, and when you're trying to cut, instead of cutting the fabric, it would just shove the fabric in the furrows. This brings me to a very important thing. When you're first learning to quilt, and sometimes, you know, especially those of us who are moms and learned to try to stick to a budget, you may think, oh, let me get a cheap blade from Harbor Freight or wherever, or my husband has a bunch of carpet blades in his toolbox. Do not use those. I'm sad to say they're too thick, and I ruined a perfectly good quilting mat by using a cheap blade, and I didn't realize it was cutting actual grooves into the mat. So use a blade made for quilting. Make sure it says it's made for quilting. Because, you know, we can try to save money on little things and end up ruining something that's a lot more expensive. So I highly recommend this Quilters Select. Is a wonderful mat. And you will notice, first thing I do, put my name on it. The care of your mat. This is very important. I can tell you from experience, I have forgotten that I was cutting on the mat. I brought it over to my ironing area, and I'm cutting, and forgot to move it, and then go to press something on one. Oh no, you have done it then. These mats are extremely temperature sensitive. Do not take them out in the car and leave them in the sun. Do not iron on them. Ever. I don't care what. Don't put anything on them that you're going to then iron on. Then do not roll them. Do not. Because you will have infinitesimal little slits, and you go to roll it, you might open up one of those slits and crack it. Plus, they are sensitive, and when they get rolled up, it's a hard time getting them to come back into the right shape. So these mats, in fact, you'll notice I have one stacked on the other because one's not bad enough to throw away yet, but this new Quilters Select is nice. It's thicker and more cushiony, and so I treated myself to that, and I keep them, store them on my desk. They say you should try not to stand them on end. If I have to, I'll stand it on end like this, but never store it half on and off a table. It has to be flat, and because it has that memory, you don't want to reset that memory going over a cliff. Also, if you ever accidentally heat one up and they get wobbly, you don't have to throw it away yet. There's a couple little things you can do. Let's say I had forgotten and ironed on this. What I would do is get a nice bath towel, sprinkle lots of water on it to get it damp, and lay it on top of the cutting mat and iron back over it carefully, making sure not to melt it. Now this is a mat that's all warped. Sometimes they'll kind of like bubble up, and so you're going to have to, you can't ever use it again for quilting unless you can give it a shot to try this. But I would lay a dampened towel over it and press over it and get it nice and warm on a nice flat ironing surface. Maybe it's on the floor somewhere where it will stay until it's totally cooled. Then you quickly lay the heaviest things, like a piece of plywood, weighted down with 100 pounds of books, 200 pounds of books, and let it sit there for a day or two until you know it's completely cooled. And carefully take things off of it and see. You might need to do this a couple times. This is under extreme circumstances. If it's not going to work, then you can take the good areas and cut them to make travel cutting mats. You can also take and cut them up even smaller and make cute little pins and glue a thimble on them and buttons and a little piece of measuring tape. So those are your choices. It's much easier to protect these than to try to fix them later. They are expensive, but this is a tool you'll have for years if you take care of it properly. Now some people say, oh, you should soak these in a bathtub of vinegar and rehydrate them. You don't even need to. The old versions would get brittle. There was an early form of plastic. You know, they've come so far with plastics. But let's say, I don't know how often, but if your quilt board just is starting to look a little dirty or something, then go put it in the bathtub. You have to wash it flat. Put it in a bathtub with lukewarm, not hot, warm. Lukewarm, which just means very comfortable to the touch, and a little soap, maybe a little shampoo. You know, any hand oils that'll get off, whatever works in your hair will work on the board. Little light, delicate shampoo, nothing harsh. And then just take a really nubby wash rag and give it a good wash back and forth. Don't rub so hard that you rub the numbers off. And I remember when I was a baby, that people thought they had to scrub babies hard. It hurt. So you don't need to be harsh. But let's say you're having a problem and you know your blade is good and you're trying to cut on the cutting mat and it just keeps skipping little bits, and you have to then take your scissors and cut the fabric apart. You may have used cut batting on it, cut minky, cut fake fur, or just something with a loose thread that kind of got tucked down into those grooves. Well, in that case, you can use a dry nubby rag and try to rub across it, because that'll kind of pull the little threads out of the little invisible grooves. Or you can take a good old art gum eraser, and this was $1.29 from a store, but good art gum erasers are wonderful, and they're good at picking all the little bits of fabric out of those grooves and just rub it across, and they're not harsh. They're just a stickier kind of glue, and not anything with an abrasive in it. So you can rub it across your mat, and there you go. You should be cleaned up and ready to go. Then you go back and put these on a nice flat surface where they can lay flat and be safe. Don't let them hang over the edge either. They have to fully be laying down on a flat surface. Now, I was telling you earlier that I've never cut myself with a rotary cutter in over 30 years of quilting. It's not because I am extra amazing. It's not even because I'm so wonderfully careful. The biggest reason I think I haven't cut myself is because this is my favorite ruler. And as you can see, I have used it for quite a period of time. In fact, over at the 0, it's been kind of nubbed up a little bit here and there. It's been very well used. So, and it's okay sometimes when you go to put the blade in, you'll chip off a little bit of that, and that's okay. I've even broken a lot of these because they're a little delicate. Don't just pick them up with one hand. Pick them up with 2 hands at all times. A ruler about this size, which is 12 inches by 12 inches of the slots, and it's a 1/2 inch slot, it's probably about $30, $35. The size I love best, which is even bigger, it's 12 by, might be 16 by 18, something like that. That's $50-some. And if you look for good sales, look for coupons, you can, that's the good time to buy these. But I would say start out first with a 12 by 12 slotted ruler. These are made, this one is made by June Taylor. And this was the original inventor of the slotted ruler. And what is so wonderful is you put your rotary cutter in that slot, whoop, you just zip up to the end, and you don't have the blade jumping out and cutting your hand. Also, this cuts my fabric cutting time in half. Let's say I want to make 2.5 inch strips. I place this on the cutting mat, and I put my blade in. I always trim up the first edge, and then I put my blade in at 2.5 and go zip, then come back, put it at 5, go zip, 7.5, zip, 10, zip. And without moving the ruler on my fabric, I've just made 4 cuts of the fabric. So not only has this helped me be a lot more accurate, it helps cut down on the time. And I don't think any of us just feel like, oh, I've got too much time to quilt. So this is wonderful. So this is the first ruler, just about the first ruler I ever bought. Maybe not quite the first, but a ruler like this is a good purchase. Now this is a 6 by 24. I might have started with a 3 by 18 or a 6 by 18 or even a 3 by 12. But I would say try to get 16, 18 inches for your ruler. This is a very good ruler, and this comes in handy when I have to cut a wide fabric that's a little too wide for this. Now the shape cutter, what I do is I make sure the fabric is laying smooth and happy. I don't force it into, to meet the edges just perfect. I smooth it out nice and smooth and happy. Then I take and carefully fold it over. And doing so by smoothing everything out, watching the line of grain, you can tell when you have twisted a fabric. And I make sure it's laying on the line of grain, fold it in half, and then that way I have my 4 layers, which I feel that's the most I can cut without using a larger cutter. Some people cut more, whatever works for you. But if the fabric is just too big or you can't fold it to cut it, that then is where this ruler is very handy. And you have to be careful when you're starting out quilting because there are rulers for every day of the week, every hour of the day. This is a little big. This is a 12 by 12, 12.5 by 12.5. We'll talk about finished sizes, but anyway, this helps so that you can square up your blocks. If you make a 12-inch finished block, 10-inch, You can lay this and trim it up, which I'll be showing you how to do. But I think I have found that a smaller, a 6.5 by 6.5 is something I use a lot. So a good 10 or 12 inch ruler and a 6.5 is good. You know, you can get them down to 2.5. But take your time. One of the problems when we start quilting is I find it's so much fun to buy all the tools and the notions, and you see somebody else has it, and well, then I bet you I should have it. It'll make me a better quilter. Before you know it, you might have ended up buying a ruler like this that I will never use again. Paying $28.50 for a one-time ruler is not a smart purchase. So think how many yards of fabric I could have had for the price of this. So this is a well-made ruler, don't get me wrong, but I am not a fan of rulers that you can only use for one purpose. To me, instead of these specialty rulers, and rulers are expensive, the acrylic that they have to use, the time cutting, the way that they're printed, the way that some of them have a good slip resistant material put on them, all of that, it makes them expensive. And that will eat up the money that you have. And right now, when you're starting out, there's too many things you need for you to worry about that. Now here are some clear grabbers. And I even found these someplace that they just marked them down to get rid of them. But these are sticky, adhesive-backed, kind of a sticky, softy, plasticky, rubbery thing that you can put on the back of your rulers to keep them from moving too much. And, ooh, I showed you this earlier. And you'll find all kinds of little handles. Okay, so how do you store these rulers? If you'll notice, do you see my cabinets over there? I just had Mark put nails where I wanted them, and then I hang my rulers. And that way I can see what I've got, because if you put them in a drawer, you'll never use them. So that's a good way to store rulers. If you have the inside of a closet door, that would work wonderfully. I've seen the wooden ruler racks. I just don't have enough table space to waste. I've seen wooden racks that hang on the wall. Now that's really cool. So that's how you store your rulers. You store your mats perfectly flat. And even if you stack them up on your desk, as long as you only have 2 high, that's a great place to keep them. But this is wonderful. So I hope you'll like that. Beginner basics, and next time we'll take up the next topic. Maybe it should be fabric, because that's a lot to talk about fabric. So take care, have a good evening. Thank you for joining me on Our Time to Quilt. Until next time, keep quilting.